Lessons learned about shared leadership. Today, our presenters are Terrence Wilson and Aurelia Montemayor. Mr. Wilson is IDRA's Regional Policy and Community Engagement Director, where he is working across the U.S. South to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline and ensure equitable access to education for every student. Mr. Montemayor is IDRA's Family Engagement Coordinator, currently serving as the Professional Development Team Leader for IDRA. He brings extensive expertise in working with high school personnel, parents, and students.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lorelei, for that introduction. So we are here to speak about the importance of family leadership. We're going to give you a little bit of an overview of how IDRA thinks about family leadership and tell you a little bit about our organization. We are an education equity nonprofit based in San Antonio, Texas. And we do quite a bit of equity work, with equity policy work in the state of Texas and throughout the South. But we also operate on 4 federally funded equity assistance centers for the U.S. South. And so that center allows us to assist school districts and state agencies in a lot of different areas related to race, religion, national origin, or gender. And so we provide free technical assistance to school districts, state agencies all across the South. So from that experience, we have both a policy kind of experience working with families and working with school districts. We also do this in terms of advising school districts on how they can better engage families, diverse families of all kinds. And so we're going to talk to you a little bit about those different aspects. And so while we're doing our conversation, we would love to hear kind of what you all's roles are in your individual places where you all work and what brought you to this conference. So if while we're chatting, if you would just use the chat bar, tell us kind of where you're coming from, your role in your school, whether you're in the district or in the district office. If you throw those things into the chat bar, it'd be really great for us to know who you are. So I just want to say welcome, and if folks would be able to do that, that would be great. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. If you have a question, we don't mind pausing and letting you ask the question out loud either if you don't want to use the chat. So we can try to monitor the hand raising functions, and just let us know if you have a question and we'll answer it. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. One of the ways that we know that you all have been engaged in this great conference all day, talking about a lot of different ways of being involved with parents, getting parents involved with schools. And so we know that there are lots of traditional ways that parents are involved, and we think each of these has its place. So we like to think of them, right, and this is not going to be news to any of you all, but we like to think of them in terms of 4 different strands of family engagement. So you think about volunteerism as one of the strands, where you have parents being able to come into the school to help either raise money or to serve as classroom, monitors, or all of those kind of different things where the parent is in a position where they're helping to aid the school. And we think that's a really important way to engage parents, make sure that parents are informed of what's going on, and it creates a really good bond between parents and caregivers and the school. And so we think that's a very important way that the parents can be engaged, right? We also think that there's a lot of focus on school-parent relationships that are focused on parenting, right? So if you think about ways that the school tries to help the parent be a better parent, right? So if you're thinking about, maybe sessions around discipline in the home or helping the student with homework, I think all of those are different examples of the school trying to be helpful with the parent being a better parent. And thank you all for putting your information in the chat as we go forward. I think the third major strand that we typically see when it comes to family engagement has to do with kind of parent self-development, right? So this is information that's targeted toward the parents to bring them into the school so that they can use the school as a resource for their own self-development. So if you think about maybe classes English classes, right? For parents and caregivers who English is not their first language, right? If you think about different kinds of ways, to focus on job preparation and resume building and all these other kinds of things that are focused on helping parents develop themselves, right, and to bring value to them and their relationship with the school. And so I think all of these are we know that all of these are really important strands of family engagement. But for us at IDRA, we've decided to focus on a fourth strand of really thinking about parents as leaders and advocates, not just for their own child, right, but thinking about the school district, the school as a whole, right? The school system as a whole, and thinking about different policies and practices that are creating some of the issues that their children are dealing with. And so our project and the way that we go about family engagement really focuses on leadership, being able to build leadership across different diverse sets of families in an intergenerational way. And we've done these over the past, Aurelio's been operating our family engagement program focused on leadership that are called education cafes, and CAFE is an acronym, which just stands for Community Action Frameworks for Excellence. And we would love to share more information about you with that. But essentially the way that our education cafes work, our family leadership works, is that parents get together and they focus on a particular policy or practice, and we teach them and we help empower them and amplify their voices to impact that policy, right? Because one of the drawbacks with some of these other family engagement strands is that you might have a parent that's really engaged, a parent that is, really gotten in and done a great job while their child is in your school. And then when that parent moves away, or that child, matriculates through school, you lose that energy, right? And so this is one of the ways, by focusing on policy and practice and focusing on leadership that's embedded at a community level, is one of the ways that we found it's important to be sustainable with our family engagement activities. And so as we go forward, I wanted to give you just a broad context, and if y'all have any questions about that context or any kinds of, ways that you have thinking about family engagement as well, please feel free to throw them in the chat. But we wanted to give you some concrete examples, so we're not just speaking in the theoretical realm, about some different examples of where we've seen this focus on leadership have a real impact on the policy and practice of an individual school district, school system. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Aurelio, so he can tell you about some of the examples that we can share about this particular focus for our family engagement. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions and discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Aurelio, to tell you a little bit about some of our success stories around family leadership and family engagement projects.
Okay. What is key about family leadership is families knowing about and influencing policy and practice. A lot of our experience over the last 40 years has been with Title I schools, poor parents, parents of color, recent immigrant parents. And there are several things we have had to face over time. Sometimes outright prejudice, but also a condescension towards these parents because they're either poor, have limited education, or of color. Somehow we get condescending in how we see their intelligence, their ability to act, or more importantly, that they want their kids to get a good education. And one of the things that has been universal in our work with parents and families that have their children in public schools, school-age children in the family, is that they want their kids to get a good education. Now, they might have all kinds of reservations about speaking up or saying anything or even giving an opinion, but the biggest hook we have on this is that we know that they're driven by that. Where I grew up in the border with Mexico and Laredo, there was a constant thing you would hear in the barrio: get an education so you don't suffer what I went through. And you see blue collar families all over, poor families thinking education is the avenue. And so based on that and our work, we think that yes, parents can volunteer and that's good, but in the other strands of family engagement, they don't come together as a group, connecting around their vision for the education of all children, and then being able to influence policy and practice so that schools are transformed. And so these family leadership projects emerge from families coming together, and they're usually most strongest when they have a community base. In other words, that they have space where they don't feel to be limited or judged by school administrators and others. So the independent base is important, although not absolutely necessary. And from that base, the community that is formed, these families connecting to each other, then come out with an issue or concern, and then with an action plan, and we call them family leadership projects. So how do these emerge? Here we are actually in the yard of a community organization in South Texas with families that are extremely, they're living in extreme economic circumstances, and most schools don't consider them typical participants, let's say in a PTA. But they're there because they were concerned about certain changes that happen in school policy. So they had a common concern. We put a blanket over the wall and then started flashing some slides on there in the wall of that structure there. And it was a pleasant Texas afternoon. But notice that this is not a classroom, it is not a building, and yet we had a very dynamic meeting there. From the common concern, then they actually learned through their work to put a plan together, a project, and then see what results that project had. So that's a family leadership and education project. And they've done quite a few. We have a strong connection with a series of organizations in that region of Texas that we're focusing on right now. A lot of the families are recent immigrant. Slide. So here's one project. Some years ago, a few years ago, the House, Senate, and House of Representatives, in their wisdom, decided to change the graduation requirements. The scuttlebutt was that poor kids and kids of color were dropping out because the courses required for graduation were too difficult. So they decided to soften the requirements. And so you no longer had to take Algebra 2 to graduate from high school and things like that. The families that we were working with are very concerned. They said, we're going to return to the old voc ed days when we were placed in low-level vocational courses. We were not considered college material, and we don't like the schools to make that assumption. And now they're going to have permission to channel our kids into a non-college track. This is what the families were saying. So they decided to find out in a 3-county area. They actually designed, remember, a lot of these are parents of limited education and mostly Spanish speaking. Yet they designed a survey, conducted it house to house. They collected over 1,600 of these. Then they put the stuff together. We helped them write a report. And then they had this regional roundtable called a Mesa Comunitaria. You see at this roundtable in the foreground, a superintendent as participant talking with some of the parents who had done that survey. As a result of that, they found out, for example, most families didn't know about the change in requirements and had assumed that their kids were somehow considered college material or were in a college track. And they all said, we want to decide that. We don't want the school to decide ahead of time who of our children are college material. And so what happened then, the school districts that were part of that survey started communicating very directly with families about the courses their children were taking. If they were in high school, were they taking courses that were preparing them for college? Because they started discovering also that when their kids got to college, they were going to have to take remedial courses for no credit because they didn't have the proper credits in their transcript. And as families learned this, they were able to connect with schools and to transform schools in ways that kids were going to be assumed to be college material and treated as such and taught as such in school. So that was one project. Then there was another one. As I told you, a lot of the parents are Spanish speakers. And there was a particular school district that had a model program, a very unique program. It was pre-K through 12 biliteracy. You've got to remember that 90 or more than 90% of the population is Spanish speaking. Many are bilingual, but they all, for one thing that's common, is Spanish is the home language. And most of them are free or reduced lunch. So you're talking about a population of students that many districts would consider at risk, not college material, and consider their first language a barrier to learning English. So you talk about first language interference. These families had experienced some programs, had the opposite, where children, hundreds of them, were graduating in high school with a biliteracy seal on their diploma, which meant they were fully biliterate in both languages. In high school, they had taken content area courses in their home language as well as in English, and they were fully literate in both languages. It's taken that school district a long time to get to that point, but that's the result. So then when the state organization that supports bilingual education was going to have their national conference, their state conference in their area, they were invited to have a meeting of parents around this issue. So they sponsored a pre-conference institute. It was planned, organized, and presented by the parents. The Parent Institute, you had committees of these parents. They recruited students and parents to speak on the panel about the benefits of this program. And then in a series of facilitated roundtables that they planned and carried out themselves. The last round was they organized the tables by community and schools. And so action teams came out as how they were going to go and see how their school districts could have a model program like the one that they had experienced in one school district. So this was another Parent Institute. And again, these leadership projects took a lot of organizing and planning and carrying out, and these are model examples. There's many smaller kinds of effects. So let's go to another example of some projects. We call them mini mesas. Mesa comunitaria is basically a public roundtable. But the parents at that one school district that I mentioned that had this model biliteracy program also had all their high schools were early college. Now, let me tell you, this is one of those districts where over 90% of the students are Latino or emergent bilinguals, and most of them are below the poverty line. And so this district now is modeling that in the high schools, all high schools offer dual credit courses, and they encourage all students to not only be in those courses, but to excel. These are not watered down courses. They're just adapted their teaching so that the kids can take pre-calculus and get dual credit and stuff like that. So then these mini mesas, what the families that were kind of leaders in these activities said, most of our families don't know about these things. The actual typical family in these smaller unincorporated communities that are like little suburbs of the urban areas in that area, they don't know dual language, dual credit and stuff like that. But they said, let's make this also an opportunity for student and parent leadership. So then they organized, we've had 5 of those that were only stopped because of COVID. The last one we had was in March, and the next, a few weeks later, then we had the COVID separation in March of last year. And so the students prepared themselves from the very beginning in presenting to the parents bilingually in Spanish and English. So you had teams of students who were in the dual language program presenting to the families about the benefits of the program, the challenges, and why they should consider their kids being in those programs. Other teams were presenting on the dual credit, what it meant, what the challenges were, and why the parents should really encourage their students to sign up for dual credit courses in their high schools. And then there was another series of presentations. This school district has a very dynamic dropout recovery program where every year they go and knock on the door of every child that did not reappear in school or they left and did not finish with their high school diploma and invite them to come back. But they set up special schools because they said if we recruit them and bring them back to the high school they dropped out of, they're going to drop out a month or two later. So they set up special schools, and the recruitment approach was, we want to recruit you to prepare for college. And so they were brought to these centers to finish their high school education, but also to take dual credit courses so that when they get their high school diploma, they already have 6, 12 or more college credit hours, and they're counseled as how to get into the community college or the four-year college in the area. And then the parents also presented on a very dynamic family engagement program where the school is offering free courses to the parents for self-development. So it was community planned, community led, and student organized and presented. And the families that attended were from those neighborhoods that the students came from. And as I said, the last one, we had 200 participants. So those are 3 examples of projects. They're obviously large. A few months ago, we had almost 40 parents from these networks actually either make public comment or give testimony to our state legislature about issues that we're concerned about.
And I think that one of the things that I would just highlight is that, Aurelio has mentioned quite a few examples with our Spanish-speaking families, but I think that these principles, right, are things that you can do with any set of families from any, community, right? And so I think that focusing on leadership is one of those things that it transcends kind of language, it transcends socioeconomic, levels, all of those things. We chose some of the examples with our Spanish-speaking families in South Texas, but this approach is something that we've done with families of all different kinds, right, all throughout the South. So I think that it's very important for us to highlight that this is something that's also transferable, right? And the main characteristics is that it's focused on policy and practice, right? At the end of these conversations, at the end of these meetings, there were concrete policies that were changed. So Aurelio, would you like to highlight just a couple of the concrete policies, changes that came out of some of these conversations to let folks know what the impact of this approach can be?
In Texas recently, we had the students are renamed. They were called limited English proficiency, which is a negative label. And now a bill was passed where the students are described as emergent bilinguals, a very positive asset-based view of the child who comes to school speaking a language other than English, an emergent bilingual. But also working in Arkansas, for example, with the State Department of Arkansas, they about 4 years ago were reviewing how they defined family engagement and making sure that their state requirements were in accordance with the federal requirements of the ESSA Act. And we were able to help guide the state so that one important element of this process that leads to these projects is that the meetings are conversational. There are critical conversations and parents have ample opportunity to speak and be heard with their peers, as opposed to sitting there and listening to school people give them information. And so the state of Arkansas now has a model where they want their school district's family engagement to include meetings where families come to engage with each other in critical conversation about their needs and wants. It takes a few more steps then for them to organize and have a project, but it's a very important element. It's a key element, and it's in Arkansas. We also saw in North Florida, we were working with their equity project, and they had developed an equity plan a couple of years ago. And they called a parent meeting and set up the process where parents come in and in small groups review the ideas and give their comments about what they think equity should be like in their schools, what their children need, so that all children are well prepared when they graduate from high school, and that the access and preparation for college is much broader than what it is right now. So it happens across race, class, in different states. We've had a longer experience here in South Texas, and that's why we give you these examples. But it's a very important issue that when parents come together, we have them come together to be listened to in focus groups, in roundtable conversations.
Excellent. So I just wanted to highlight that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, helping school districts, schools increase their family engagement with a specific focus on leadership is something that we do with schools. All of y'all mentioned where you're coming from, right? Like, I think we work with all the stakeholders that are just like you all over the South on helping school districts focus on leadership. And so we wanted to provide you with a few examples, and we wanted to allow space for questions and discussion. And really, I wanted it to hear from a couple of you about whether or not you all put, family leadership and policy and practice change as a priority in any of your work. So, and if so, what does that look like? And I think part of this conference is good because you can hear from us, but you can also hear from your fellow colleagues and peers across South Carolina. So we wanted to allow some space for that conversation to take place as well. So if folks would want to come off of mute or put it into the chat. And the question is how you all focus on leadership, policy, and practice in your family engagement activities that you do with your constituents and your stakeholders.
This is Lorelei, the moderator, and I have one small example. I'm really intrigued with this, and I'm glad I'm learning more about this, but we tried to start conversations with our school stakeholder teams about ESSER funding, and just being very involved with that and letting them know about what it is, and letting them know that it's very important for them to share their voice as community leaders and as parents while these plans are being developed. So that was really our first attempt, I think, at addressing policy with our parent leader groups.
Yeah, that's a great example. With the laws that have come through with the American Rescue Plan, a lot of it has that parent engagement requirement as a part of the actual receiving the funds. But I think what you mentioned is important, right? Not only building the capacity to receive that input, but building the infrastructure and the mechanism so that there can be ongoing change that's made according to what we put in those plans. So often when we talk to parents and families, we hear about how the schools are always asking them for information, right? Asking them how they feel about this. They've got a survey about this topic, right? But there's a lot less that is put into working together collaboratively to address some of those issues that are identified from that information. And so I think that one of the things we encourage schools when we talk to them is to have, that authentic two-way communication, as Aurelio mentioned, but to not stop there, right? But to move beyond and to create opportunities for parents to work on changing, some of those policies. So for example, with the funding issues that have come up, there's examples around, the textbooks, there's examples around, teacher shortages around certain things, right? So how can we, once we identify where a disparity is, where an inequity is, how can we work with our parents and families to help address that concern? And so I think that that's great that, a lot of folks, I think we're already doing this work. I know that you all are already doing this work in a lot of other places. Some of the requirements that came with that federal funding forced them to think more about, family and parent input into those spending priorities. But I think that the next step is really, creating an advisory committee, having participatory budgetary processes. There are some school districts around the country that actually have, students and parents on advisory committees when it comes to the school board budget or the school budget. And so I think that these are all really good examples about, where we can go once we get this information. But I'm glad to hear, Lorelei, that y'all started that conversation around school funding. It's very, very important.
We just had a Zoom session yesterday, and this issue was one of the ones we focused on. We didn't call it the ESSER funding, but said the parents knew schools are getting a new amount of money, extra money from the federal government because of COVID. And they had very concrete ideas, and they're going to approach their administrators and the school districts about that. They're going to form committees from that session to say, because we have that space and health issue, hire more teachers and have more space for our students. Ensure that happens. In other words, they had very specific ideas in terms of that the money should be used. For example, a lot of families said we have very weak connectivity, and as long as we have this back and forth, face-to-face and distance learning, make sure that we have the resources that our children who suffer during their learning suffers during period, but at least give us better connectivity. So that they were very clear in thinking, if you have the money or you need the money, get it and spend it in these ways. And they had very concrete ideas about that.
And Lorelai, from your example, I mean, what were the parents, were they anxious to, or were they excited to give you their opinion? Did you have any trouble pulling out what they thought that money should go toward?
Our biggest challenge was getting them to stop talking. Just like they were just like on each other,
Right.
and saying, we want follow-up. We're gonna get together. There are several parents from one school and saying, let's get together. Let's they're learning how to go to a school board and make a presentation and stuff like that. So there was excitement and very serious concern, as all parents have all over the country, about the health of their kids, but also saw that their education is important, and they see this dilemma right now that the distance learning just wasn't working for their children.
And Lorelai, did you have a similar experience? I'm just curious.
I'm going to say not so much. It was a new experience for them, and I think this model could really begin to grow that. But we do have another question in the chat from Reader WC. Is the policy change you advocate at the school, district, or state levels?
So all of the above. I mean, really, the primary spot for our family engagement is at the local school or local district level, primarily, and we connect our families into larger state level policy work. But there are examples, as Aurelia mentioned, where we're working with state agencies where we try to bring that family perspective into the decision-making processes at the state level, whether it's at the legislature, the administrative agency. But I would think a lot of what we presented today is really focused on the school, either one school or a school district. And I think that one of the things that we found helps these to be successful is to have a base of operations focused in a community. Most often, if that's a partnership with a community-based organization, right? So we have a really great organization called Arise in South Texas that we work with, that Aurelia's worked with for a long time. And so that local work makes that experience much more relevant, right? It also builds community and connection as a byproduct, right? Also, obviously, we want to improve the functioning of our schools, right? We want our policies and practices to be more equitable for our students, but also as a byproduct of these conversations, we're building community, right? These are neighbors, these are folks that have their kids in the same school or have had their children in the same school, right? That have a vested interest in seeing these things be successful. So we've seen that be a little bit more sustainable if we've got that local community-based focus. Aurelia, would you add to that?
Well, yeah, I'm remembering in the early days of No Child Left Behind, we were working with a very large high school in a border town in El Paso, in fact. Their high school had 3,000 students. These were the schools that emerged out of the economy of size ideas many years ago. And the test results had just come out. We were meeting with some parents monthly there, and the test results came out, and the students of that high school, over 50% of them had failed the math test, the sophomore year test. It was the state required test in the early days of those state requirements. And so we had created a website where they could see the data, and as they were looking at it, one of the parents said in Spanish, "Estamos reprobando matemática." We are failing mathematics. So they created a survey. The principal was supporting them because the principal was very concerned about the scores that were coming out, the teachers were. And they did a survey, and then some students crunched the data and presented it to the parents. And so as a result of it, the school professional development for all math teachers included issues that the parents had brought up. If a student doesn't learn a concept in one way, what are some other ways to teach the same concept? You know, be open to student questions and don't rush the curriculum because you have to finish the chapter next time. And so there was a very direct relationship between what the parents did and said and learned, and then what happened in professional development for teachers in that school. It's a little example, but an important one, because again, it's parents that were being listened to for the first time, heard for the first time, and feeling their real partnership. And that was school-based. It was a high school, you know, and of course, there was some ironies there because we had asked, give us some of the best students in math to help the parents crunch their data and so. Well, they sent us the students that were sent to the office for disciplinary issues, and they were sitting around the principal's office. So they sent those kids, and it was amazing because they just put the stuff together and presented for the first time to their parents. So it was a double win there in terms of student and parent.
Excellent. Yeah, and having students involved, we talk about a lot about parents, right, and families, right, but we also want to make sure that these spaces are intergenerational, that there's a space for students at these tables, and that not only parents are involved when we're talking about families, we're also talking about all of those, folks that are in charge of taking care of students, whether it's a biological parent or another person, or and also that we're including students. We want to make sure we have a very inclusive view of what we mean by parents and caregivers. So very, very important point. And so one last question, maybe one of the last questions that we have is, as you all, so we've heard, one example of folks who have started to incorporate a focus on leadership and policy into your family engagement work. For the folks who are thinking about it or that have not yet done it, what are some of the barriers that you all have seen to moving your family engagement in this direction?
Hi. Right now, I think COVID, of course, and then trusting teachers to hold to their words and then just do what we say we're going to do.
Julia Beatty's question is really good. It's in the chat. I told you some parents gave public testimony and public comment to our state legislature a couple of months ago. Those that went through the training and actually carried out that task received a beautiful diploma, bilingual diploma, that said that so-and-so had participated in the training and acted as a leader in speaking directly to state legislatures. And they had a Zoom ceremony. The leaders of the organization honored each person. I think there were 30 of these given out. So there are many different ways that the community finds ways to celebrate those that take action within,
And just to pick up on the comment that was made, I think that, COVID has obviously been a barrier, right? But we have found ways to gather in community spaces, even in virtual means. But we also know that there's no substitute for going to communities. That's why I think we've been able to, partner with these organizations that are based in communities to be able to reach people where they are, right? And obviously we know, like the pandemic, hopefully at some point in the future, we don't know when, we will be able to get back into that. And hopefully the digital connections that we've made will be able to sustain some of those in-person conversations, right? So I think that's a really good point that you raised, and I appreciate you for raising it. And the other one that you mentioned about trust, I think is very crucial. I think that oftentimes when we go to a school and we say, okay, we're going to start organizing parents and caregivers around policies that they want to change and problems that they see, the red flags can go up, right? Because there's lack of trust going both ways, right? Schools can see parents or caregivers as a problem to be solved. Parents can see schools as the problems toward their students getting what they need to be successful in school. And so I think building that trust is important. And I think that one of the ways that we kind of bridge that gap is around making sure that the leadership of your school, whatever, if it's principal or superintendent or the folks that are in charge are willing to take a critical look at what is going on, right? We don't have success when you're in a conversation with the school and the parents, and the parent says something critical and the school automatically gets defensive, right? The school has this lack of trust and tries to, put down or defend, right? I think that one of the things that we have to do is have leadership that's able to say, we know we're not perfect, we know we can move forward, and we also know that a lot of these things are not they're not intentional, right? These are policies that have been in place for a long time, and we need your help to be critically looking at it. We're working with a group in Virginia right now. We're looking at their entire, set of school board policies with an equity lens. And so we wouldn't be able to do that, talk about building an anti-racist school environment, right, without the leadership being able to build that trust and say, no, we know that we're not perfect. We know we want to improve. We want to do this with you together, right? And so I think that's one of the ways is that you can build trust is one, that communication, right? Like honesty, authenticity, and really just including folks in the process from start to finish. Oftentimes schools will reach out, get information, and then reach out when they've come to a conclusion about how to change policy. And so I think having the mechanisms along the way, which is kind of what we're presenting with these community meetings, with these structured conversations, these projects, these touch points along the way, so that folks feel like you're doing things with them and not to them, right? For the folks in this room that understand restorative concepts, right? Doing things with people gives you much more faith and confidence in the outcome rather than doing it to them. So I think that's the way that we try to go about building trust. A great point. And I see that we have a couple more
Well,
in the
Terrence,
chat.
we have, just to let y'all know, we're at our 10-minute mark,
Okay.
remaining for the session, but there are some good comments in the chat from Aurelio and Julia. If you'd like to unmute and let us know what y'all are talking about.
This is Julia. I was just pointing out that I would say a lot of times I think teachers and administrators might underestimate parents' capacity to examine data. Like you said, they sat down, they looked at this. I think that they don't realize how capable families are with just a little bit of orientation to some of the crazy acronyms that we throw out. And they can really help contribute some meaningful solutions. I think that schools are afraid to kind of open those conversations lest the parents realize how difficult things are for educators, but that keeps them stuck in being the only people that can come up with the solutions. And if they don't invite families in, they can't involve families in the solutions. And it really does take both parts of the continuum to create these solutions.
Yeah, thank you for that. We agree wholeheartedly. Go ahead, Aurelio. You want to say something?
Well, one of the things that I think is important in all this is that we're talking about a lot of the parents that schools wrongly judge as not educated enough, not interested enough, not something enough. And so when we approach them as being intelligent people who want the best for their kids, we just have to make sure that the words we use are understandable, because there's some college professors that don't understand educational jargon. I've had them as parents in my sessions, and what's this IEP shit? It's like they know the acronyms of their profession, but not of our own. And that's true. And so that doesn't mean you're weakening the presentation. No, you're just making it understandable to the layperson. And beyond that, though, is this respect of really listening. A lot of the parents that have not been active participants at first don't know what to say when you say, what do you think about the education of your kids? A lady will tell me, nobody has ever asked me that before. And as she hears other people respond to the question, all of a sudden you can't shut her up. There's like, it's this open-ended critical conversation that comes from, I honor you as a parent, and I want to listen to what you think. Now, let's several of you get together and see if you have a common vision about what you want for the children at this school and how can we get there. Let's say we have a lot of dropouts or something. Most of our children are failing science or whatever it is. Parents understand data when you present it in an understandable way, and they might become the best team that you've got to improve what happens on the campus. Because, I don't know in South Carolina, but in Texas, we still have that scoring system, that three and you're out. And so that if a school gets a failing grade 3 years in a row, they might shut it down. And those schools happen to be in the neighborhoods that need a good school to stay alive and open. And so parents can become that tool to say to the principal and the staff, look, we're going to support you, but let's see how we can improve things, because we don't want the door shut on our neighborhood public school.
Absolutely. Were there any, we've got time for maybe one more comment or question before we close out. And thank you all that have participated. I'm sure your colleagues are very thankful as well for hearing some of your experiences.
Yeah, we have about 5 more minutes left. If a school or district were interested in developing one of these parent leader groups or action projects, what does the support and the tools look like from IDRA?
Well, we've got our website. Here's our, if you click this link, it'll have a conversation about our brochure. You can also visit our EAC South website, which I will put here in a moment. That's got more information about how to get in contact with us. Aurelio and I kind of coordinate our family engagement work, right? So send us an email. We're pretty open to it, and so even for all the folks that weren't in this session but that want to reach out to us, we are open to, getting in contact with folks, helping advise. And the beautiful part about our grant is that South Carolina is in part of our service area with the EAC. So we're able to come and bring these resources, have these conversations, help organize these meetings free of charge, right? That's one of the things that we know that we hear often as a barrier, is that cost is an issue. And so I think as long as there is an identifiable equity issue that folks are trying to address. So for example, if, one of the schools we work with, they notice disparities in their ability to get in contact with their Spanish speaking families, or they saw a disparity in how much contact they got back from their Black families versus their Hispanic, Latino families, right? Like, so I think as long as there is an equity issue that's at the core of it related to race, religion, gender, and national origin, then we can provide our services. So those are 2 sites to go to that I just put it in the chat. If you want to have some more information about the success of some of these community education projects, a lot of those examples can be found in the book that my colleague Aurelio just published. And so there's a link to that book there. And so Aurelio, you want to tell, it has the same title as our presentation today. Would you want to say a brief note about the book before we?
Sure. Our colleague and our external evaluator, Dr. Chavin, and I wrote a chapter, it was in a book recently published called A Place Called Home, School, University, Community Collaboration, and Immigrant Education Experience. A lot of the content we presented today is in that chapter in greater detail. But, Alachua County Schools in Northern Florida in Gainesville sent a letter of request 3 years ago saying, we are developing an equity plan. We're especially concerned about the participation of Black families because we have a huge gap between our Black students at graduation and our white students. And our equity plan is addressing it. We need your help in carrying out this plan, but especially the engagement of families. So if you have, as Terrence said, in the request, is especially powerful if it comes from an administrator, a superintendent, asking us to assist the school district with these kinds of equity issues in terms of family engagement. We have, as a project, by the way, it works far beyond that. We do teacher training, planning, all kinds of other stuff. But here we're focusing on the family engagement part.
Good question. All right.
I think we are about at the end. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for a wonderful.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And please remember that we have our